Right, thank you. Thank you for whoever was just singing then as well. That was lovely. Okay, welcome back to the Haunted Landscape. If you only just got here, we've had a slight switch around with our schedules. So we've got Brian Hoggard next, talking about magical house protection, the archaeology of counter-witchcraft. So basically, if you want to keep Satan the cat out of your house, or a male witch's attack snails, then this is the talk you need to listen to. Please welcome Brian Hoggard.
Hello, everybody. Before I start, that's a picture of my beautiful book up there. There are some copies available at the bookshop at the back, but we're not sticking around very long today. We've got to shoot off somewhere else after this, so if you want one, get one quick. There is my website up there and my email address. I'm not just saying this to big myself up, but follow me on social media, because sometimes people who find things in their houses actually report them in real time on my social media, on Twitter and Facebook. And it's quite exciting to watch the reactions people have when they found things in their homes. So I'm going to be talking to you about the archaeology of magical house protection. Essentially, this is people who were scared of evil things. Quite often this was witchcraft. And how they would protect their homes and themselves from the perceived evil of witchcraft. Okay. Before I start talking about the actual finds themselves, I always do a little big up for Ralph Merrifield. This book, some of you may be familiar with already. It came out in 1987, The Archaeology of Ritual and Magic. It covers several thousand years' worth of British archaeology, but there are 2 chapters in it that cover a more sort of recent times, like the 17th century and the 18th century. And it was those chapters that inspired me to take up my research project, because I realized that historians of witchcraft, by and large, weren't giving any airtime, as it were, to the archaeology that was being found in buildings. So there's this huge amount of physical evidence about witchcraft, these actual objects which can tell us a huge amount about witchcraft, which just don't get a look in when you look at a history of witchcraft book, generally speaking. There are a few exceptions, but generally speaking, if you buy a history of witchcraft book, it won't talk about the archaeology. So that's what I'm doing, and that's what I'm here for today. So before we start talking about the actual objects, I want you to try and imagine being in a beautiful 17th century timber-framed cottage in the 17th century. You believe in witchcraft. You're scared of witchcraft. There are witches nearby. You believe there are witches nearby, and you think they could harm you or your family or your property. Okay, so that's where we're starting from, okay? And now these objects that I'm going to talk about will hopefully explain how people dealt with this fear. So we're going to start by talking about the fact that there is actual physical evidence for black witchcraft, okay? It's not something people were just accused of. We find objects that prove that people were doing what we would call black witchcraft. This particular slide you can see here, this is from Prestwich in Greater Manchester. Prestwich was kind of like a little village just near Manchester before it got swallowed up. And it has a beautiful church, and there's a pub next to the church, and the churchyard sort of overlaps with the boundary of the pub. And they were doing some work in the cellar of that pub and discovered there was a false wall. Okay, so they were thinking, well, this is peculiar. There should be a space here, but there isn't. They discovered this false wall. When they knocked it down, they found a little bag with these figures inside it. They also found a deceased cat, and they also found a pile of what was described as vegetable matter, which I interpret as being the ingredients for a spell. You know, some roots and other vegetables that were important for whatever spell was going on. Now, the important thing about this is that the figures have been stylistically dated to the 17th century. And whatever was going on in there involved the sacrifice of a cat, and also it was deemed so important that they couldn't just sweep it away. They had to build a wall to hide it away. So for me, this is evidence of black magic. And obviously, that cellar does actually butt onto the graveyard of the neighbouring church. So I think that whoever was doing the magic thought that was significant too. So that's just a sort of pointer to the fact that we do have genuine physical evidence of black witchcraft. And I'll show you a couple more in a bit as well. So, for example, this one. I thought the slides were in a different order. It's caught me out, but I'll roll with it. So this here is a beautiful little lead curse that was found in Dymock in Gloucestershire behind some oak panelling in a lovely old building there. And it's written in mirror writing, which I'm sure some of you know is the best way of communicating with the devil or communicating with darkness. And it's a curse on a girl called Sarah Ellis, who is reputed to have died in the area, and there is actually a crossroads in the area that she is reputed to have been buried at. There are lots of sad tales about Sarah Ellis, who was cursed by whoever made this charm. And you can see that the nature of it being a small lead tablet is very, very similar to the old Roman curses that used to happen as well. And this shows the kind of, there is a kind of direct sort of linear tradition with some of these practices. So there's a curse, and here it comes up a little bit dark on the screen. There. But this is from Hereford. It was found again behind some panelling. It's a little curse doll that someone had made very crudely. It's made essentially out of a stick with a rag around the head, and there's this big skirt. But what you can't see too clearly is that there is actually a little line visible along here, and that's because there is a big written curse tucked into the skirt, sort of wrapped around inside the skirt, and that is also on a local girl in Hereford. This is from the 19th century, and so you can see we've got a 17th century example, 19th century example, exactly the same thing still going on, people actually practicing black witchcraft, and so people are having reason to fear. They must know this kind of thing was going on. Okay, so here we have a witch bottle. Hands up if you know what witch bottles are. That's good. That's loads of you, actually. That's really good. Okay, so what we've got here is, this one was found in Felmersham in Bedfordshire. It's a classic 17th century, what we would call Bellarmine witch bottle. They were nicknamed Bellarmine after a much-hated cardinal who everybody thought this kind of big pot belly and fearsome visage resembled him, so they nicknamed them Bellarmines. But actually, they're called Bartmann stoneware, and they come from the Rhineland in Germany. They were imported in hundreds of thousands into the UK, full of beer and wine, which was then consumed. And then the bottle, because it's made out of really high-quality stoneware, which in England we couldn't make at the time, they would be reused for many purposes. And then obviously, because they're slightly anthropomorphic, we've got this big belly, we've got this kind of mottled, salt-glazed skin to the bottle, as it were, and this fearsome face. People used them in magic. I mean, if you were going to do some magic and you needed a vessel to do some magic in, and you had one of these, you'd think, oh, I know, I'll use that one, because it is very anthropomorphic. Generally speaking, we find these bottles buried. About half of them are buried in front of the hearth. Often they are buried upside down, and inside we find a collection of pins, which have usually been deliberately bent. We also find nails, nail pairings. We usually find a big lock of hair as well. I'll show you some pictures to show you that. So here, from Merrifield's book, is the typical contents of a witch bottle. This one's from Ipswich. And you can see we've got some long bent nails. We've got a big mass of hair there. We've got this fork with a broken tine. We've also got some fabric, which is thought to have been sort of roughly cut into the shape of a heart as well. Now, the thing about, I'll show you another one actually. So here's another one from Greenwich, which even more clearly bent nails. In this particular case, my friend Dr. Alan Massey, who did the analysis of this bottle, discovered that these nails had all been bent around a pole of the same radii. Yep, so they'd all been bent together as one, proving that this was a ritual act connected with the making of the witch bottle. Because people used to sometimes think that the nails included in them were just found from local sort of demolished sites, that kind of thing. But this bottle and some others proved that actually it was a deliberate act as part of the making of the bottle. So what we have when we find them is there's liquid inside as well, and that liquid is urine, okay? And the pins have, as I said, been deliberately bent, and then we also put the big lock of hair and nail pairings, lots of things to do with the actual person involved. And what we think is going on is that essentially this bottle that's buried by the hearth, again, think about this 17th century cottage that you're living in the 17th century. The hearth is the only part of your building that's always open to the sky. So you can shut your windows, you can shut your doors, but you can't shut your chimney. And so that is the place that is the focus of most of the protection, which is why we found about half of these at the hearth, another 25% at thresholds, and another 25% under the floor. What appears to be happening, and you have to bear with me a little bit on this, is that when we kill the nails, we release the kind of ghost nail. Okay, so we have this kind of now a supernatural nail, as it were. And imagine the witch or wizard has exuded some harmful energy towards you. They've been ill-wishing you. They've been doing some kind of ritual. They've released this energy. It's floating through the landscape, coming to seek you out, to cause you harm. It gets to your house. It's trying to find a way in, and it can't. It eventually comes down through the chimney. It's trying to sniff you out. There's your urine and your hair inside this trap, essentially, inside an anthropomorphic bottle. It looks human-like. It dives down to attack it instead of you, so it's a diversion. But it's also a trap because it's been impaled on these nails which have been ritually killed within it. Okay, and this seems to be the thinking that's going on with witch bottles. I've explored many ideas, and that's the best one so far. Okay, now there are some late 17th century texts that seem to refer to witch bottles as well, but they talk about the boiling of witch bottles, which is a completely different practice. So there's this idea that people would, if they felt that they were bewitched, the idea was that there was something of the witch inside them. So if they urinate into a bottle and then torture that urine inside the bottle with pins over a fire, that will cause pain to the witch's bladder, who will then beg for you to stop boiling the bottle, and in return they'll unbewitch you. Okay, so there's this practice of boiling witch bottles, which is also written about in about 5 different early modern texts in the late 17th century. But the burying practice seems to be different. Okay, so there's this, like I say, it's some kind of energy trap for the spell of the witch. Here's an X-ray of the Greenwich bottle that I showed you the contents of a moment ago. You can see all the nails and pins have accumulated in the neck because it was concealed upside down, and there are a few others in there as well. This is a slightly different one. It's got a lot of exposure on Facebook and Twitter in the last week because the niece of the man who found it sort of suddenly did some more posts about it, and everyone got very excited about it. But it's this bottle is very peculiar. It's really small. It sits in the palm of your hand. It's only about this high. And at first, it feels like it's solid, but then while it sits in your hand, it turns to fluid. And my friend Dr. Alan Massey, again, he analysed the contents because he is a doctor of chemistry, and discovered that what we have inside this bottle is a mixture of beef tallow and spring water. So we think, because this was found at a parish boundary wall, we think that someone believed their cattle had been bewitched, and then took some of the fat from that animal, blended it with some holy water, and used that, if you like, as a witch bottle to protect the cattle instead. Another example, very briefly, this one, a late 18th century example from a really grand house overlooking the M1 in Essex. We did some filming for a really cool Channel 4 documentary called Real Wizards, The Search for Harry's Ancestors. I was very proud to be involved in that one. I should point out that Professor Hutton was also in that one, and various other people, so I wasn't the only one that got drawn into the amdram that joined the segments together. But yeah, it was good. But this was really, really good. So late 18th century, and we discovered that the lady of the house in the late 18th century was suffering a long lingering illness, which she eventually died from. And it seems that people believed that she had been bewitched, and so they put these bottles in the hearth. And actually, a week or two after these ones were found, we found another one on the other side of the hearth as well. So they'd tried multiple times to sort of unbewitch or cure this woman of witchcraft or prevent the attacks of witchcraft. Peculiar case, that one actually. The widower sealed the house up after she'd died, and it remained closed until the high finance stockbroker who now owns it bought it, and it had all kinds of incredible 18th century things inside it. Concealed shoes. Let's have a show of hands for concealed shoes. Who's heard of those ones? Okay, again, quite a few. Right. So concealed shoes, it sounds a bit dull, doesn't it, concealed shoes? But this is the most common type of find that we come across with this type of study. There is, believe it or not, a concealed shoes index in Northampton Central Museum. It's a museum that specialises in the history of footwear. And the pioneer of this area of study, June Swan, she set up the Concealed Shoes Index, which thrives to this day. There are over 2,000 separate accounts of concealed shoes in the UK at the moment. They're usually found singly, and they're usually very well worn. Okay? Pairs of shoes amount to less than 10%, okay? Which straight away shows you that this isn't people just getting rid of rubbish. Okay? There's some kind of special thing going on here. They can be found anywhere in a building. They can be found under a floor, inside a wall. They can be found up inside a chimney, sometimes on a little brick ledge up inside a chimney. If you go into an early modern house, stand up inside the chimney and run your fingers around where you can, and you can literally find shoes that way. And sometimes you find them in giant hoards as well, in voids inside buildings. So there are some buildings where there have been over 100 recovered from the same building. And the dates of the shoes, because we can date shoes very accurately according to their design, and people used to publish catalogues of the different designs that were available, so we can date them very accurately. And sometimes the deposition of shoes inside buildings can sometimes span over 250 years. So it's a direct tradition of people in that building concealing these odd shoes in these great big collections. It seems a bit odd, doesn't it? Concealing shoes. But then we learn of the legend of John Shorn. Again, this is something that Ralph Merrifield first drew attention to. He's an unofficial English saint. He came from North Marston, which I believe is in Buckinghamshire, thought to have died around 1309. He's reputed to have cast the devil into a boot. Okay? Now, he was never actually canonized officially. So this isn't a saint you could speak to the Catholic Church about. This is kind of like a folk saint. But the really important thing about John Shorn is that the pilgrimage to his shrine in North Marston was the second most popular in the whole of the British Isles for a period of around 250 years. The only shrine that was more popular was Thomas à Becket in Canterbury. So much money was being earned at North Marston through this pilgrimage that it was moved to Windsor so the royals could benefit from the. It's a nice little windfall for them, isn't it? Sounds familiar, doesn't it? But anyway, they. So it was eventually returned to North Marston, but the important thing is that people would collect pilgrim badges when they went on pilgrimages. So images of shoes with devils poking out of them or with other kinds of footwear became really, really well known. And also images of John Shorn were often painted onto rood screens in churches as well. So this was a really, really well-known idea that you could trap evil inside footwear. But then also, if you think about the sympathetic magic thing, you think earlier on with the witch bottle, we've got this anthropomorphic device which has your urine in it, your hair in it. And here, in these, in the old days, as it were, shoes were very expensive, and you would wear them until you couldn't wear them anymore. You would have little cuts put in the side of them. You would have them expanded, enlarged. This is where the idea of Cinderella's shoe comes from. Shoes would end up being unique to your foot. So by the time you disposed of your footwear, it was unique to you, and it could be used in this form of sympathetic magic. The idea is any negative energies coming into the building, they're trying to attack you. They think they've found you when they find the shoe, and they attack it instead of you. And then you've also got this belief, as we see with John Shorn, that you can trap evil inside footwear as well. We also find shoe outlines in graffiti, which Crystal might talk about as well after me. This is an example from Canterbury Cathedral in the cloisters there. There are hundreds of shoe outlines. It seems that sometimes people did this as part of a pilgrimage. They'd get to where they wanted to go and they'd draw an outline of their shoe on the stone bench, and then they'd move on. But the idea is that some of the sort of blessedness or holiness of the building would be translated through their unique foot outline. That's what I think, anyway. And we often find this in lead on church roofs as well. Dried cats. We all like cats, don't we? Yes, of course we do. Okay. I like cats a lot, actually. This particular cat was found in the thatch of a cottage in Eckington in Worcestershire, which is a village I used to live in. It was found very, very thick thatch. It was found about halfway down. There's absolutely no way it could have got there by accident. Okay. This is the thing with dried cats. We have many, many examples where they've clearly been deliberately interred. For example, in the roof in Penrith, up in Cumbria, there was a cat. This is in a church, remember, which should have God's protection. And the cat was found sandwiched between plaster and laths up inside the roof. Okay, and then another example from Darlton in North Yorkshire, a cat was found wired to floor joists. And then we often have these anecdotal references as well to cats that go missing during building works, and then the builders are like, "Oh, I'm so sorry, your cat got into our hole," and these cats are rescued. So this is like I've got records of anecdotally over 200 of these cats on file at the moment. And there are many, many more. If you speak to anybody who's involved in historic buildings restoration, you could literally phone up your local builder and say, "Have you ever come across a dried cat?" And there's a good chance they'd say yes. This was incredibly common. Now some people are very proud of their dried cats. For example, the Red Cat Hotel in Norfolk have theirs on display, so you can admire it while you're enjoying a pint. Some people thought it wasn't real, so they had it x-rayed, and it is real. And there's its last meal as well. So, and cats, there are several pubs and hotels in the UK that have cats on display, which I think is nice, actually, because they're celebrating the history of their building and the things that happen within it. Now, some people used to think that these cats were deliberately interred as vermin scarers. Now, anyone who knows what a rat is like knows that it would very quickly ignore anything dead or eat it. It's not going to work, basically. And then other people have suggested that it might be a foundation sacrifice. In fact, I briefly had the chance to meet Terry Pratchett, and that was one of the things he suggested to me, was that maybe you gave a life to the building so it wouldn't take a life later on, which is a good idea, and that is part of what foundation sacrifice is. But the thing with cats is that we find them in all parts of buildings, roofs, walls, under floors, you name it, we can find them there. And what I think is going on, again, is that we've got this kind of benevolent relationship with cats. They're semi-nocturnal. I think people were trying to trap the spirit of the cat to the house to act as a guardian for the house in spirit form, but acting on things like the witch's familiar or spells that might be coming into the building. So essentially we've got a little creature catching vermin, but on a more sort of astral or spiritual plane. Okay, and this again, them being semi-nocturnal, while you're asleep, they're still out there catching the prey for you. Okay? And again, this might sound slightly bizarre, but remember, we're talking about 17th century people for whom magic was an absolute reality, and it was all around you all the time. Written charms. So we don't find so many of these purely because paper is very fragile, it gets damaged very easily. This particular example is mid-19th century from Sarn in Wales. And we actually have in the National Library of Wales, in Aberystwyth, there's about 15 or so of these charms, all by exactly the same cunning person. Okay, so this is something that people would go and commission from their local cunning person, which you may know would be what we'd otherwise call the local white witch, and they're very interesting. Okay, I'm gonna turn to the correct page because I haven't been using my notes at all today. I'm going to turn to the correct page and read you a bit of this. It is in here somewhere. Written charms. Okay, so it says, Lord Jesus Christ, be the preserver of William Pentrinant, his cows, calves, milk, butter, cattle of all ages, mares, suckers, horses of all ages, lambs, sheep of all ages, pigs, sows, and prosper him on this farm to live luckily, safe from all witchcraft and evil men or women, spirits, or wizards, or hardness of heart. Amen. So in the 19th century, someone believed that all of that could harm them and their livestock and their cattle. Yep. And they paid someone, probably quite handsomely, to create this charm. But as part of commissioning that person would come to the farm and do rituals and protection symbols and all sorts all around the perimeter of that farm. The entire property involved in that farm would have several rituals over several weeks leading up to the final act, which was the deposition of this charm or the concealment of it on the building. So we find these charms sometimes wrapped up in little files, sometimes folded up into a piece of lead, sometimes tucked between bits of masonry or timber. They're not just religious, they're not just about Jesus, as you can probably see. What we have here is an abracadabra word charm, which is from Arabic magic. We've got a lot of astrological symbols at the bottom as well. And we've also got a symbol which crops up in the Key of Solomon, which was a widely available grimoire published as a little pamphlet that lots of cunning people had seen. So the cunning person is basically drawing their supernatural power from whatever source they can get. And then they're also doing these actual rituals on site as well, which may include observance of moon phase, may include things like burying eggs in the soil, could be all sorts of things going on as well. So this is a live magical belief system which is going on, and we find these from all over the country. Here's another example from Sheffield, but this one was designed to be carried inside your clothing. So this one would maybe even have been stitched into someone's jacket. Horse skulls. We're doing okay for time. I'm getting through this. This is like the fastest version of this talk I've ever given. Okay, so horse skulls. First thing about horses is that they are beautiful, big, lovely animals, aren't they? They have a benevolent relationship with humans. They're nice creatures, very twitchy, very sensitive. Talking about cats being nocturnal, I'm told that horses sleep with their eyes open. So I think people believed that they would be extra vigilant. Okay, and also you see here that the actual horse skull on its own, like this, is actually an incredibly impressive thing. You'll see on, I think, some T-shirts outside, they're images of the Mary Lloyd, I think. So, you know, the horse skull crops up in folk dance as well, where I think it's acting almost as a kind of gargoyle. It's going around scaring local spirits, scaring spirits away periodically, annually. And we have them buried quite often underneath buildings. So, for example, at a pub called the Portway in Herefordshire, they found 24 horse skulls screwed to the underside of the pub floor. Yep. And there's another hall in Herefordshire where they found another 24. And then there was in Ireland in 1954, they did a survey of traditional Irish cottages and found that most of the hearths had a horse skull buried underneath the flagstone in front of the hearth. And when they asked what the explanation was for this, local people would say, oh, it makes the fiddle go better. Yeah, or it makes the acoustics better. Or they'd make the dancing sound better, okay? But when I'm not doing stuff like this, I am a musician. I'm a guitarist and a guitar teacher, and I often sing to Herbert with my guitar, and it does not improve the acoustics at all. Okay? It really, really does not. Okay? I can vouch for that. Okay? So what I think is going on with the acoustic explanations is that essentially people are finding a way of explaining away their mysterious behaviour. There they are, sort of down the street with their horse skulls. The vicar's like, "What are you doing?" "I'm making the pub sound better, honest." Okay, so I think that's what's going on. But Ralph Merrifield, again, my inspiration, late 19th century, there was an example of some builders who were cutting the foundations for a new nonconformist chapel in Norfolk. And they sent the builder's boy out to get a horse skull from the local knacker's yard. They put it on a stake, poured a libation of beer over the top, said a few words, and they did that before they would commence the building of the chapel. Okay, and in most Welsh chapels, for example, that have ever been excavated, there's a horse skull somewhere underneath. I'm not going to talk about hoards because we're running short of time. I'm going to quickly skip across some of the symbols which we use for protection. We can use the word apotropaic if you like, but essentially this is protection marks. This compass-drawn rosette, if you like, is otherwise I call them daisy wheels. Other people give them different names. I don't think it really matters as long as we all know what we're talking about. This crops up as graffiti in buildings and churches all over the country, and it actually first appears in prehistory. So we find examples of this in Egypt, of all places. We find it all around the Mediterranean. We find it in ancient Greece. We find it in ancient Rome. We find it in living cultures throughout Europe as well. In the early 17th century America, it was used on gravestones, and they openly referred to it as a solar symbol at that time. And the same in Romania. They currently regard it as a solar symbol and still carve it onto gateposts in rural dwellings. It seems to be that the idea with this, as far as I can see, is that it was bringing the light of the sun to a place so that darkness couldn't hide there anymore. Okay, that's my interpretation of it. Other people may have different interpretations. We often find circles or daisy wheels like this on church coffers, for example, which obviously needed protecting because they had valuables inside. Here's an example from an 18th century cupboard, which I have in my house, much to my partner's chagrin. And then here's an example from Somerset, a beautiful thing. This was another TV programme to do with Nick Knowles. But anyway, I was asked to do a report about this door. And here we have the daisy wheel as a decorative motif on an internal door in a beautiful farmhouse. I would love to have that door. I love that. We also find these things that which we refer to as Marian marks because they seem to relate to the Virgin Mary. Okay, so the Virgin Mary was a much-loved deity within the Christian pantheon, and she was loving and nurturing, and people missed her, especially when she was gone. And so actually, these marks that seem to relate to the Virgin Mary carry on well beyond the Reformation. These particular ones are from Prince Arthur's Chantry in Worcester Cathedral, who would have been King Arthur, no less, had he not popped it before his brother Henry became King Henry VIII. And again, we've got a fabulous chantry chapel here, for which nuns and monks were probably singing prayers, and yet people still felt it necessary to put these M's, these double overlapping V's, which are upside down. They look like M's. And you can see in this particular case that these arms taper out towards the end. And I'm going to ask you all now if you can see. If you look on the palm of your hand, you'll see you have exactly that M on the palm of your hand, if you're lucky, okay? And it crops up in graffiti quite a lot. And to me, I think we've got a Marian symbol, but it also happens to be a Marian hand mark as well. It's on your hand as well. And we find it in all sorts of places. I found it on memento mori on tombs in cathedrals. Here's also mesh marks. We get these apparently random crisscrossings and scratchings on some surfaces. This one's from some shutters in an 18th century house in Shropshire. We also find them, I found them on a gable end in a 17th century building in America as well. The entire loft on one end was completely scratched up like this. And again, this seems to be some kind of mesh or net to prevent evil from entering in, sort of symbolically. Where you've damaged the surface, I think people believe there might be an actual line left behind, but on the other side, so that it would prevent badness from coming in. We also, this is my final little bit here, we also find burn marks quite often. Now, these burn marks they're not just where a candle has fallen over and singed the wood. Someone has deliberately burnt the surface of the wood. Two vernacular architecture historians, John Dean and Nick Hill, did a recent, I say recent, it's a few years ago now, study about these burns, some really good experimental archaeology to find out how these marks were made. And some of them are so deep you can fit your thumb inside them or your finger inside them, and that does not happen by accident. You have to deliberately burn, then scrape away the carbon layer, and then reburn, and it can take up to 20 minutes to create one of these marks. And also, if it was just from a candlelight or a taper, you would find a hole where that light had been fixed to the timber, and we don't find them. So these burn marks have been deliberately applied to these surfaces. On this particular bracing beam inside Llancaich Fawr in South Wales, this is the dormer window above the entrance to the building. There are over 100 on this beam alone. And I think what's happening again is we're thinking about things being killed so that they appear on the other side. I think what we've got is each one of these deliberate burn marks is a candle flame now burning on the other side, acting as like a chandelier, a bit like with the solar symbol earlier with the light of the sun keeping darkness away. Here we've got the light of candles permanently keeping darkness away, but on the other side. I'm going to conclude with my very badly paginated slide about a conference which is happening next year in Chester. There are some flyers at the back. It's called Hidden Charms 3. We run it every 2 years. It's brilliant. We'll have 9 speakers through the day, and I'm one of them, but there are lots of others as well. Anyway, that concludes my talk. Thank you very much for listening, everybody. Thank you.